taking stock. I've been reading a conversation online about the language we use when we are discussing, or should I say arguing about, something we consider important. The discussion on language arose because someone decided, after due consideration, that it was perfectly acceptable to refer to the current incumbent of the US presidency by a series of the kind of short, sharp, fricative and glottal stop-laden words which, had I uttered them in the presence of my mother, would have earned me a visit to the kitchen sink to have my mouth washed out with soap and water before being dispatched to my bedroom with no tea. And that was when I was 32. A point of interest was that nobody seemed to object to the sentiments being expressed about the president at all. In fact, they were mostly in agreement with them. It was purely the choice of words used, the language in which the criticisms were couched. Now, I debated with myself long and hard when writing this piece as to whether I should desist from my usual shy and retiring nature and, by way of example, actually quote those words directly. The only problem is that, well brought up as I'm sure you all undoubtedly are, you'd probably switch off this video and not listen to the point I want to make, were I to do so. That's the funny thing about the English language. It's probably one of the richest languages in the world, and yet it's also amongst the most class-ridden. We all evacuate our bowels and bladders, after all, every day. I hope so anyway. But whether we do that in a lavatory, a toilet, a loo or a bathroom will define your perceived social class just as quickly as your accent. And that isn't even taking into consideration at least two other nouns that I can think of, which even I wouldn't use, especially in church, to describe that place, but which would definitely place me very firmly into one particular social class were I to do so. It's also odd how much of an historic hangover is concealed in our choice of language, especially bad language, or should I say, language considered generally to be bad. English has been enriched by, and as we now speak, it has had contributions to its development from at least three different sources, thanks largely to conquest or large-scale immigration. The original Brythonic tongue of these islands was suppressed and driven largely to the west and north, actually, by the ingress of the Angles, Jutes and Saxons to become what we now know as Welsh. Welsh words remain, largely disguised though by a respelling in English, mostly as place names or geographical features. One of the largest rivers in England is the Avon, and Avon is the Welsh word for, yeah, you guessed it, river. You'll find many place names in the west of England which end C-O-M-B-E, as in Babbacombe, and the Welsh word for valley is Cwm, C-W-M, as in Cwm Rhondda, the famous Welsh tune. You'll find that the same is true in the east and northeast of England, where place names often end in the letters BY, Grimsby, Normanby, Derby, Rugby, Whitby, Selby, or WICH, West Bromwich, Norwich, or THORP, as in Scunthorpe, well, except that's got an E on the end of it. All of these denote that the original settlements were Norse, or even more specifically, Danish. To this day, in the Viking city of York, the streets are called gates, and there's an area town gate in sight most of the time. But the Danish word gade, G-A-D-E, which transmuted into gate in English, means street. After the Norman invasion, French names began to be applied. In Essex, we have Faden Boys, more correctly bois, the French word for wood. And there are others closer to home, of course, here in Colchester. Layer de la Haye, Thorpe le Soken, Tolshunt Darcy. You get the picture. It's an interesting and long linguistic hangover from before the Norman conquest that, because of the mongrel nature of the inhabitants of these islands, the English vocabulary is so rich, carrying words of Anglo-Saxon origin, of French origin, and even words of Danish Viking origin. But what I am thinking about today is not just the linguistic hangover, but more interesting, the long social hangover from the Norman conquest and what was effectively French domination of England, the English and the English language, which still echoes down the ages, in that pretty much all the words now considered vulgar have their roots in the conquered Anglo-Saxon tongue, and words with the same general meaning but considered polite derive from Norman French. You can probably think of a few yourself, but one example would be the Anglo-Saxon word stink, as contrasted by the apparently more refined French word odour. Which of these would you consider more polite or genteel, which is a word which itself derives from a French word? It's also intriguing how the social divisions of the Middle Ages are perpetuated in our language in other ways which go unnoticed because, well, we don't really think about them. The common people, mostly Anglo-Saxon in the Middle Ages, looked after the animals, the pigs, the sheep, the cows, which provided the meat that in general only the rich could afford to eat. But the meat isn't then called Anglo-Saxon words like pig, sheep or cow. By the time it's arrived at the rich man's table, it's called porc, and bœuf, beef, and mouton, mutton, unconsciously underlining Norman superiority. If you can say it in French, you can afford it. Language matters. Words matter. How we say things and what type of language we use can make all the difference. Partly because the language we use can not only upset someone, but can betray our own unconscious bias and sometimes our bigotry. In other words, we perpetuate the bigotry and injustice which have shaped the language in the first place if we don't use it carefully. D.H. Lawrence mounted what was in effect a one-person campaign to rehabilitate the Anglo-Saxon language, to wash the words clean of their supposedly obscene, vulgar connotations. He argued that to use the words correctly, as he would put it, rather than as insults or expletives, was neither obscene nor vulgar. It was merely correct. It was the unadorned and, in his eyes, unencumbered and unjudged use of verbs or nouns. What he discovered, though, is how difficult it is to scrape centuries of privilege or snobbery or calumny from the words we use. What we discover from the failure of his experiment and other similar but less literarily laudable attempts at linguistic rehabilitation is that we need to choose carefully the words we use. It isn't just about what we mean when those words leave our lips. It's also about what other people understand by those words when they reach their ears. Donald Trump's words and actions over the past 4 years have been inflammatory and divisive. They've been laced with boastful, provable falsehoods. They've been aimed at stirring amongst Americans the deepest cultural ingrained prejudices which are buried in the psyches of the unstable, the ignorant, the bigoted and the prejudiced by the constant unthinking use of language which is still redolent of the worst excesses of post-Civil War and pre-civil rights America. However hard he tries to extricate himself from the linguistic, cultural and political sewer in which he has wallowed all his life, by denying his responsibility for the horrendous events in the Capitol last week, he'll fail. He is betrayed by every word he utters, whether deliberately or unconsciously, and I believe it's deliberately. His problem, you see, is not that people didn't understand what he said. His problem is that they understood exactly what he said, and exactly what he meant in what he left unsaid, and then went out and did it. Our words are weapons, people. Our words matter, they weigh and they make a difference. We need to use them wisely and well, carefully